So we're about 5 after, so I'll get started. We are recording the presentation. It will be on the library's Facebook and YouTube account. So if you want to reference it later, share it with others, or connect with Randy again, you can review the PowerPoint, the presentation then. So thank you everyone for joining. I am Samantha Williams. I am the current Entrepreneur in Residence, EIR, at the New Haven Free Public Library. As the EIR, I host bi-weekly, twice a week, business consultation services. So if you're in need of some coaching and guidance as an entrepreneur, aspiring or current entrepreneur, business person, I am available twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays from 2 to 4. Also, as the EIR, I host weekly presentations for the small business and entrepreneurial community. So today we have Randi McCray. As you can see, she's an online activist, and she is going to be sharing lots of good information that we need to know about the Black Lives Matter movement, its history, and how it impacts you in the workplace. So I'm going to hand it over to Randi. Colleen, did you give Randi access to share?
I have share screen is one participant can share at a time. So that should be just Randi. Are you able to?
It's still disabled. So you either have to give me temporary host control, where I'll also be having to simultaneously monitor the waiting room as people come in. Or if there is an option, if you put your mouse over my image, my picture, you may get some additional options for just allowing me to share my screen.
I think I just changed it to all participants are allowed to share screen.
Yeah, I got it.
All right, perfect.
All right, so as Samantha shared, I am, among other things, an online activist, but I always start my work by centering this on the people who we are, that brings us to this discussion. And so before I talk any more about myself, I'm actually going to share my screen and start my presentation and then come back to a little bit more about me. So I invite you right now on your Zooms, if you want to turn off your video, you can, but you also can enable speaker view so that you can just see the person speaking and the actual presentation. So with that said, I'm just going to go ahead and get started and kind of get into what I do. So.
Took away a man with children who depended upon their daddy on a daily basis.
Your history is extremely uncomfortable for America. They'd rather shrug you off or shoot you dead in cold blood. You remind America that they still haven't done right by you. You're powerful, brothers and sisters. And never forget your power of choice. And while your humanity appears to be at risk, remember that you are divine and that you have the power to choose. To choose how you react, how you walk, how you talk, how you protest, how you spend your money. Let's start thinking about these new rituals as we move forward.
John Crawford.
Here.
Tanisha Anderson.
Here.
Dante Parker.
Here.
Tamir Rice.
Here.
Tony Robinson.
Here.
I think there is contagious quality in a movement like this when everybody talks about nonviolence and being faithful to it and being dignified in your resistance. It tends to get over to the larger group.
Walter Scott, say his name. Walter Scott, say his name. Walter Scott, say his name. Walter Scott, won't you say his name? Jermaine Reed, say his name. Jermaine Reed, say his name. Jermaine Reed, say his name. Jermaine Reed, won't you say his name? Philip White, say his name. Philip White, say his name. Philip White, say his name. Philip White, won't you say his name? Say his name. 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 Eric Garner, 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 won't you say his name? Trayvon Martin, say his name. Trayvon Martin, say his name. Trayvon Martin, say his name. Trayvon Martin, won't you say his name? Sean Bell, say his name. Sean Bell, say his name. Sean Bell, say his name. Sean Bell, won't you say his name? Say his name. 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 Won't you say his name?
Freddie Gray, say his name. Freddie Gray, say his name. Ayanna Jones, say her name. Ayanna Jones, won't you say her name? Sandra Bland, say her name. Sandra Bland, say her name. Sandra Bland, say her name. Sandra Bland, won't you say her name? Say her name. 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 Won't you say her name?
Tommy Yancey, say his name. 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 Jordan Baker, say his name. Jordan Baker, say his name. Jordan Baker, say his name. Say his name, won't you say his name? I'ma y'all say his name. I'ma do the y'all say his name. I'ma do the y'all say his name. I'ma do the y'all say his name. 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 Won't you say his name?
So that was how I usually start what I do. I bring in the voices of the people who we're talking about, because there's a way that we have these conversations without like talking about them as practical matters. Right? These are people who have died, whose lives have been cut short due to policies and procedures by police officers, or have been victims of vigilante justice. So my name is Randi McCray, and I'm not only an online activist, I do this work for a living with organizations. I do a lot of racial justice work with organizations who want to do a deep dive into their policies, practices, and the ways that they work in their communities to become anti-racist organizations. I work mostly with nonprofits. I also am a teacher, and I am a PhD candidate at a social justice institute. So I always start my work, and I know there's a lot of ways to enter into this conversation, but I start my work by centering how I come into this work on the voices of the people that we're talking about, whose lives are being impacted by the state of race relations in this country and in some other countries. But a lot of what we'll talk about today is in the context of the United States. I don't often do 1-hour workshops only because this is a lot of deep work and we need time and space to process. Before COVID, we had the opportunity to be together, to do more interactive and to do more relational work. So I try to create a relational experience in the work that I do. But we are now in the moment of a pandemic and it's safer for all of us to be in a virtual environment. So to the extent I can, I try to bring in the other elements that we normally would do in person. And one of those things is really bringing into the space with some intentionality and some mindfulness, those of the people who we are talking about, because they can't be here, because their lives will cut short. So with that said, that video was in 2016, and we are now having this conversation. There has been a resurgence in this conversation due to the lives lost by these 3 individuals recently. Ahmaud Arbery, a victim of vigilante justice on February 23rd. Breonna Taylor, a victim of a no-knock warrant policy on March 13th. And George Floyd, May 25th, when a police officer knelt on his neck while he was handcuffed as he laid face down on the ground. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's more than a hashtag, it's a movement. And the sad part about all of this is that there are many names that don't appear in that video. My screen is not big enough to fit all the names of the people who have been victims. But this goes back to the origins of Black people in America, right? This has some deeply rooted ways that this is manifesting in our society. So before anybody that you heard in that video and before these 3 individuals whose lives were taken, we have Emmett Till in 1955. We have Rodney King in 1991 and James Byrd in 1998. So that is why we're here and that is why we're having this conversation. So now that we've centered ourselves on who we're talking about, I'm going to attempt to sort of demystify and clarify some of the things that are surrounding the movement and some of those demands and what those things mean. Because once we get to the heart of the matter, now we have to get to practical action and ways that we can take action. And even though we've invited the business community to this conversation, this matters to all of us. And so towards the end, I will talk about what you can do for yourselves and the ways that we're asking businesses to show up, right? So it's more than just about protests and the destruction of property. It really is a call to action to show up for Black people. So I'm going to bring that into the space as well, because the hashtag sort of started with these 3 individuals, Patrice Colliers, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, where they initiated a call to action to all of us across the globe, not just here in the United States, to ask us to create a new vision for young Black girls around the world who deserve to be fought for. And we deserve to call on local governments to show up for us. And she talks about how, race for individuals happens on a spectrum, right? So depending on where you lie within that spectrum is the extent to which you feel sort of the aftermath and the legacy of race and racism in the country. And so this call to action was in 2016, and there was a hashtag, but as I said before, as we look at just the example of Emmett Till, we have been calling on America to acknowledge the validity of Black lives for hundreds of years. And so we are now in another moment where we're seeing protests and we're seeing people having awareness, but we want that awareness to actually translate to action for the governments to show up for us. So I'm gonna move. So today, as you saw, we started with saying their names. So I always call that into the space, the welcome and introduction. And now we're gonna talk a little bit about the movement, the protest, the movement demands, why it matters to you and your business, and how you can take action. So Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a man, it never did and it never will. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about so many different things, but at the core, it's really like communities feel disempowered over things that control their lives. And a protest is the raising awareness about that. It's the voice that we all have. This country was built on protests, right? So the things that we celebrate, the things we celebrate on 4th of July is literally a result of protests for people who did not want their lives to remain as is, feeling like they were under control of an entity who didn't have their best interest, right? And so Frederick Douglass said this because power does not concede nothing without a demand. There has to be a demand so that people can respond. So here is a horrible timeline, right? Like I have to show this, but this basically calls our awareness to, and there's so many names that aren't here, but it calls our awareness to the many individuals who have been victims of either a police officer, oh, no, these are all victims of either a police officer or someone, an average citizen who felt like they had the right to take a life with whatever thought and reasoning they had in their mind. And some of these things pull on the heart, right? Like when it's an individual vigilante, we try to appeal to people's hearts. But when it's police officers, we have to appeal to policies and our elected officials to create policies that hold people accountable, but also change systems that allow these things to happen. When you look at Breonna Taylor and the no-knock search warrant, that is a particular policy on which they entered into her apartment. She ends up dying and they were at the wrong house. It wasn't even the right person, right? But it's the policy that was literally the foundational springboard for that situation. And so in these matters, in many of these matters and in many of these circumstances, we're looking at those particular policies that allow these things to happen. Here's another timeline that brings 2020 into play. So we have Ahmaud Arbery, we have Breonna Taylor and George Floyd on this timeline as well. And then we have where you see sort of these protests, right? And the responses to those protests. When they deploy the National Guard to a protest, you know, it sends a message about, you know, people's trampling on people's fundamental right to have their voices heard through protests. Like I said, this country was founded on protests. So the very notion that when something happens to me in this Black body, that would be met with militarization really perpetuates, you know, this criminalization of Black people and the fight for freedom. And so this is why we have these conversations around Black Lives Matter, is that we need to change the hearts and minds of individuals, but also really look at the policies and how we respond to the value of Black lives. So another example, you know, this image came across my timeline today, and it was just so, it captured it so perfectly, right? Like when a white person shoots up a school, we express empathy. We look for the reasons of how we want to support them and reach out to them. So we look at mental illness, but if a Black person kneels in protest, you know, they're called a disgraceful thug. And that's a trauma for people of color to constantly be met with that opposition to the value of their lives. And so the hashtag is Black Lives Matter, My Life Matters. It's calling us to look at people differently and treat them differently as if they are valued in society. So here's an opposing way that happens, right? Dylan Roof killed these 9 people in a church. And he, on his way to jail, they got him a meal to Burger King. That sends a very troubling message to people in society that say you don't matter, and your body doesn't matter, and your life doesn't matter. And those people who were killed, did their lives matter, right? So we have to ask ourselves these critical questions. One of the things that I neglected to mention, as I said in my introduction, is I would tell you how I do the work. And Sammy had said something about fun presentation, and I said, I don't know about that. How I do this work is I try to hold space with empathy and care and allow for all perspectives to enter in the room. But I also challenge people to see what they cannot see, investigate what they don't know, and always interrogate further. Don't just take something that's on the surface and subscribe it to a group of people. I consider myself a truth teller, so I'm always going to tell the truth. And sometimes the truth is very difficult for us to hear, but I also believe as a foundation, as a practitioner in equity work, that if we're not talking about the right thing, then we can't create appropriate solutions to the problem. So if we're not talking about these things as a systematic thing that goes all across society, then we won't create the right solutions for that to have, for us to dismantle this. So, you know, that's what I neglected to mention early on. And so while I realize that this may be troubling for some people, right, it could be traumatizing for Black people of color, for people of color and Black people, but it also can be triggering for people who don't identify as a person of color to see this. We have to talk about these things in a very direct and truthful way so that we can create the appropriate solutions to change what's happening for people. So, so the movement is, so I want to take a little bit of time because I get a lot of questions around the movement. What does it mean? And so it's not just a hashtag. And as I noted, this has been long-standing in our society for a really long time. So these are some demands that was on their website. They demand an end to the war against Black people, demand reparations and targeted investments to build a world where Black people can thrive, and defunding systems and institutions that criminalize and cage us. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Economic justice and self-determination, and the end to anti-Blackness. What they mean by anti-Blackness is that everything that's Black gets ascribed to something negative. Everything. That's what allows the perpetuation of vigilante justice. So when you look at police or law enforcement practices, that is one part of it. There's another part of it that there's this notion of anti-Blackness in the United States of America, that everything we're doing, we're just out living our lives. We can be jogging in a park. We can be doing anything that an average other person could be doing. And this anti-Blackness that we have that runs throughout history and throughout the hearts and minds of individuals up to today allows what happened to Trayvon to happen. Even though he was told not to pursue him, he did anyway. That is a notion of anti-Blackness. And so we demanded into anti-Blackness that led to the death of Trayvon Martin. And we demanded into state-sanctioned violence against Black people. When people protest, we don't want to send in the National Guard. And so we're going to go into a little bit about the defunding and systems of institution that criminalize and cage us, right? Like, because I think that's where a lot of people seem to be confused when they hear the term defund the police. They think it means that law enforcement will be canceled tomorrow and that there'll be no police on the street. That's not true, for one, and there's models that we can look to where it's happened, i.e. New Jersey. So that is what I want to talk a little bit about. So, and also this notion of when we say Black Lives Matter, that people meet it with only Black Lives Matter. That's not what we said. That's not what we're talking about. Calling awareness to something in the moment is a direct result of people feeling like they don't matter. It doesn't say only Black Lives Matter. It says Black Lives Matter. Like, hey, we're here. We haven't mattered since we were stolen and brought here. So I won't say step foot willingly because we didn't. But since we were brought here, we've never been valued. So you have to understand the history around what it means and the value that the United States has put on a Black life. And just because we're not still enslaving people state sanctioned, there are other ways that people in America are kept in cages and unable to move. And that's all rooted in the value of those individuals, regulating them to segregated communities, not investing in their schools, not investing in community programs, all says that we don't value you. So a child who goes to a school in one particular area, right, versus another area, and you see that drastic difference in the resources they have, I have to question, how much do you value that child's education and the outcome of their life, right? So it's not that only Black Lives Matter, it's really calling America to remediate its origins and saying that Black lives didn't matter. It was in the Constitution, right? And they were property, they weren't considered human. And that has a legacy, and we are living in that legacy. Right? And so we have to say Black Lives Matter until Black lives truly matter. So we don't meet that with only Black Lives Matter or all lives matter. All lives can't matter until Black lives matter. So if you make that statement, all lives matter, you have to say, well, do Indigenous people lives matter? Do you care what happens to them? Right? The Flint water crisis is a direct example. The response to Hurricane Katrina, direct examples of how we value those human beings, because we didn't show up for them. So we can't say all lives matter until we're showing up for all lives equally in this society, and we are far from there. So the other reason I wanted to bring up the defunding thing is because I was troubled by an ad that jumped on my television this morning while I was sleeping, so I thought I was dreaming. And it is an ad from our horrible, horrible president. I don't usually talk about him, but unfortunately, this literally is terrible. The ad is a phone rings, and the operator says, "You have reached 911 police emergency line. Due to the funding of the police department, we are sorry, but no one is here to take your call. If you're calling to report a rape, press 1. To report a murder, press 2. To report a home invasion, press 3. For all other crimes, leave your name and number. Someone will get back to you. Our estimated wait time is currently 5 days. Goodbye." That is the ad, and it says at the end, this ad was endorsed by President Donald Trump. So we know he knows about it and he endorsed it. This is not what defunding the police means. That is exactly not what defund the police means. It does not mean you're going to call 911. You're not going to get an answer. It doesn't mean that you're going to respond. For those of you that don't live in urban communities, I want you to understand what defund the police means and why it's a problem. What happens in urban communities is they are proactively policed. Police show up, they're waiting in the wake, they patrol, they're waiting for a crime to happen so that they can respond. In less affluent communities, and I know this from experience, there you don't see a police officer. You can go a whole month and don't visually see a police officer unless you see them at your local Starbucks or your bank. Where I live, I only see police officers at my Starbucks and my bank. I never see them driving down my street unless there's a fire or something happens, but they're not proactively policing my community. So when we say defund the police, there's targeted investments that have been made that pay for that. And so what you're doing is you're criminalizing a group of people on what you think they may do. Not what they're doing right now, what you think they may do. And so could those same dollars be targeted at the Boys and Girls Club or other community programs that are received well and much needed and are proven to work? There's national data that supports that if you invest in children as early as preschool, they have better outcomes later on in life. It's called the Perry Preschool Study. It was done, all the participants who are in that study are now the same age as me, almost 45. It's a longitudinal study where they track the lives of children from Chicago, low income, grew up in impoverished communities, but they saw that when you made targeted investments in young people as early as preschool, it reduced the probability of all the things that they proactively police in our communities. So I happen to work with preschool in New Haven, and I see the limited funding that gets and the burden that families have on sending their children to preschool. But we proactively police those communities and we don't invest in preschool. So the next time someone says defund the police, I want you to think about that one example, and I can give you 1,000 more at that, what we're talking about, right? Defund the police means pull some of those investments out that you invest in proactively, right? Planning for something to happen in a community versus investing in the health and well-being of those communities. And so it doesn't mean that the police are going to go away. It doesn't mean that you're going to call 911 and they're not going to be there. It absolutely does not mean that. So one of the things you can do is learn about what differences are. There's a lot of people that explain these things. Some supporters look at divestment, which is reallocating some resources, right? And some of them talk about disband, which the funding is an initial step towards creating an entirely different model of community-led public safety. We can reimagine what policing looks like, right? By starting with defunding the police and creating a new construct. So, I do a lot of anti-racism work, and the best way I can create a visualization of this is if you have a tree and that its roots, right? For people in Black Americans, the roots of our origins in this country are rooted in devaluation, othering, brutal, humanity acts being used, right? That's our roots in this country, right? And if you don't tackle something at the roots, the tree will just keep reproducing things that are a result of what's at the root. So when you look at criminalization of people in the United States and in other countries, there is a root to that. And so when we talk about disband or dismantle, it's really saying, let's take out the thing that keeps producing this, right? And create something new so that we can produce different outcomes for people. So you can read this article from CNN more thoughtfully, but I grabbed this out, which people talk about, what these concepts mean. And so that you don't kind of think it's this, because that's not what it is. It's really more of this. And so much of really understanding the Black Lives Matter movement is doing our own homework to learn what we don't know, to challenge what we think we know, but also see what we cannot see. For some of us on this call, we didn't grow up in, over-policed communities. We don't know what that means. We grew up in communities, some of us on this call, who may not identify, or I grew up in the projects or whatever, who may not have grown up in those type of neighborhoods where you only called the police if something happened and that's the only time you saw them, right? And even if they did come out, if you happen to be teenagers doing something, you got to go home. It's not like that in urban communities. So I'm challenging you that if this is all foreign to you, to do your homework and understand what is the lived lives of those people we talked about at the beginning, right? That's why I brought them in, because this is about their lived lives, not ours. And there's a way that we come to the Black Lives Matter conversation from our own personal experiences and not the experience of those that are actually feeling this in their communities. So what does this mean for your business? So for people of color, I want to say that for us, these conversations can be traumatizing. They can re-traumatize us. So I urge you to practice self-care and leave when you need to. If you're in a space where these conversations are happening, practice self-care, right? Because it can be challenging to see that on the news, but then go into spaces where you're not, where there's less of you than there are other people, non-people of color, and having to hear what people say, and that could be re-traumatizing. So I urge you to practice self-care and disconnect, so that you can, for your self-preservation, right? And then reach out if you need to your support networks, but there is an actual crisis line. Because I do these presentations with all different groups of people, and I did this with Black mothers, and one mother shared with me that, she can't get her son to understand why she's so concerned, because he's 22 and he's like, I have a license, I'm not doing anything wrong, I don't understand what the problem is. And she's saying, listen, I get all that, but I just want you to come home, right? And so when I have those conversations with mothers who that Trayvon Martin could be their son, Eric Garner can be their son, Ahmaud Arbery can be their son, Breonna Taylor can be their daughter, Sandra Bland can be their daughter, I have to tell them, I have to hold that, and then equally say, they need to practice some sort of self-care, because that is a very traumatizing way to live. And we know from all types of health reports the impact trauma can have on your lives on a daily basis and stress level, and it can actually manifest itself as physical conditions. So I urge people of color to practice self-care and remove yourself as needed. For people who don't identify as a person of color, silence is not an option. So, since this has come out, a lot of businesses have kind of issued statements and things like that. And that's great, cool, right? Because silence is not an option, right? And I want to remind us that Martin Luther King said that when it comes to the time of silence, there comes a time when silence is a betrayal. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about these things that matter. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So when he wrote Chaos of Community, or he did Letters from Birmingham Jail, he wasn't calling on people who were already showing up. He was calling on so-called pastors, faith holders all across the world, like, show up for us. Don't let this conversation just be about us. So, and they showed up in droves. It was a call to action to say, I know that this doesn't directly impact you, But in the end, we will remember not the words of our friends, but the silence of our, the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends, right? So if you consider yourself an ally, if you believe that you're sympathetic to the Black Lives Movement, silence is not an option. Sharing on Facebook, raising awareness amongst your friends and community, that's all great, but we do need to take action. And so I always have to bring in Baldwin because I am more of a Baldwin person than I am a Baldwin and Malcolm X person, as you probably have already been able to ascertain that from this presentation. I'm more of a thinker that's aligned with them, but Baldwin, and I bring this into all my work with groups, is that change, if you want it to happen, you have to get rid of the world as you've always known it. That's with you, right? Like you grew up in your community and things were like that for you, but they're not like that for everyone. Sorry, there's multiple truths and things were happening all over the world. I was watching the Anita Hill case, and that happened in 1994 when I was in high school. I had no awareness that that was happening. I had no awareness of the intricacies when it comes to women in the workplace being subjected to sexual harassment and how that gets dealt with and managed, right? And then when she speaks up, what can happen? I had no idea of those details because I was in high school when it happened. When I watched it, I realized like what was happening for me in high school in my little world, and then that was happening too. So, you know, if you want to be different in this conversation, you have to get rid of what you've always known, right, as the singular truth around this. Your community was not over policed, okay, but there are communities that are. And so you kind of have to get rid of, if we want change, when we talk about dismantling, that's what we're talking about. We can't have, like Audre Lorde has this quote where she says, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I'm probably paraphrasing. So we can't have the change we want to see that really values Black lives if we're trying to integrate that change within a construct that is designed not to value Black lives. So that's what we talk about when we talk about dismantling systems, right? Is we're talking about getting rid of the thing that we've always known it, that we hold as our identity, and that is our safe place. Because for some people who this isn't their everyday lives, it's very comforting for them to know that they can have this just as a conversation. They can be a spectator in this conversation, right? And that gives us a sense of safety, right? Like that we can just watch this on TV and that we can go back to our everyday lives, right? And so if you really want to be different as an individual, it starts with you, and that will spill over into your business, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it starts with you to really challenge everything, the world of you as you've always known it, and say, okay, that wasn't the whole world. That's not the whole story. There was another story happening that has cultivated what we see today. And I want to enter into that conversation from that place, and I want to be different after it. So what does this mean for your business? What we are concerned about when it comes to Black Lives Matter and from businesses and the statements that we've been hearing about is we don't want brand activism. We don't want brand activism. We don't want just statements, right, that say, we value Black lives, right? That's cool, great, thank you. Thank you for standing in solidarity, right? But don't go back to business as usual when you're done. Your business values should be lived from within. So as I told you, I do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. I challenge them to revisit their mission, their vision, and their core values that drive their work, right? And so those values can't just be a statement. They actually have to be lived from within your organization. That means individuals in your organization have to be anti-racist so that you can adopt a culture of anti-racist practice in your work. And show up for Black people authentically, right? There's a way that people kind of just say it because everybody else is saying it. They share something on Facebook because somebody else is saying it. But are you authentically showing up for Black people, right? This is mine. Vote your wallet. This is mine. I am in a social justice program at Union Institute and University, and I'm a public policy student. One of my friends who's on the phone, she can tell you I talk about this all the time. I keep her up at night for hours. She lets me go on and on. That's why I love her so much. But policies create a lot of the inequities you see in society. That is just a fact. You can take a 2-day training with me and I can break it all down for you. What we need to be different is we have to create policies that undo this. So when we go back to those demands that were listed, where it talks about, defunding the police and ending state-sanctioned practices, that's the people who make decisions in your community. Decisions get made at the very local level, and there's some that get made at the state level. 85% of those decisions control how things happen in your community, local and state level. The federal, not so much, because of the way our Constitution was designed. Our Constitution was designed so that states can operate with a degree of autonomy, which means people can have different experiences in different states, which means police practices can be one thing in one community, be something in another community, right? So you have to hold your elected officials in your communities that represent you accountable to what you value, right? And so don't just leave that on people of color to do that. Stand in solidarity, consider yourself an ally, and say, you know what, the people who vote for me, I'm going to challenge them on how they're going to show up on critical pieces of legislation that affect people's Black lives. When we talk about economic investment versus investing in more state-sanctioned police practices, that's what we're saying. Invest in economic growth in these communities, right? You go through certain communities in New Haven, you could just see, the lack of economy and opportunity. But you will place a police substation there, you will place cops there who are rotating on a consistent schedule, where little babies have to grow up seeing this constant presence of police, but their parent may not be able to put them in preschool. So vote your wallet, right? Like, hold your elected officials accountable. Connecticut is a very segregated state, something people don't really realize, because most of the people who don't realize it live amongst people that look like them, or they live in some diversity. Connecticut is a very segregated state. You can look it up. The Connecticut Housing Association did a map recently. It's a very segregated state. So what does that mean in terms of voting? That means most of the reps in Hartford are representing that broader community that outweigh those smaller communities, Bridgeport, Hartford, Stamford, and New Haven, right? That's where the highest concentrations of people of color live. The rest of the state, Connecticut is still one of the wealthiest states in the union. So the rest of the state is a very white state, and those are making up your elected officials. So if this doesn't matter to you, the only thing that we want you to do is stand in solidarity with us and say it does matter, and we want you to vote your wallet. The other thing is, we talk a lot about speaking on behalf of people and things like that. Let Black people lead. Hire people within your organization in leadership positions. Cultivate a pathway for people of color in your organization, right? And so some people, when they looked at the blurb about today, probably thought that I was going to give you, I don't know what your expectations are, but I know the way that businesses come to this conversation is they really think about how's it going to affect their bottom line. And from an altruistic perspective, all I can say is that we rely on your heart to join in solidarity to show up for Black people. If you are ascribing that to just the bottom line of your business, I don't think you're ready. And I'm just going to say that directly. I urge you to get ready to authentically show up for Black people if that's where you're entering this conversation, and that's where you still are at the end of this conversation. We are asking for something different. And so this is what it means to your business. I don't have another way to sugarcoat that. I'm just telling you, don't do brand activism. Live your values if you value them, and adopt a culture of anti-racist practices, and hold your elected officials accountable to the things that matter to Black people. Because when you do the best for the least of us, everybody else benefits. That's why it matters. If you center your decisions on those that are carrying the heaviest weight, it has no way to go but up for everyone else. In this work, I've worked in communities where their school is all white. The children are all white. And they'll say to me, well, we don't have to talk about diversity and inclusion because we only have white children. Okay, but That's not right, because even if you have white poor children in your community, if we are focusing on, as Alicia Garza pointed out, the spectrum of race and how people feel it, right? If there is the spectrum of race and Black people are on the bottom and someone else is over here, like further along the spectrum, if we centered our solutions on the people who have felt it the most, Black and Indigenous people and other people of color, right, then it's going to automatically help a white poor person, right? So, we're just asking you to show up differently, and don't show up inauthentically by just putting out a statement, but really show up authentically. Some more practical things you can do is you can learn more. I have hundreds and hundreds of reading lists. This is by far not an exhaustive list. There's one book I wanted to recommend. It's a professor at Yale. He's called Locking Up Our Own. You should read that book as a starting place. And I didn't get a chance to add it in here today. I actually have the physical book. I went to his talk 2 years ago. But there is a blog where this person has curated a bibliography. And then when Ferguson happened, there was a syllabus put together and a list of resources to read. And there's also just a quick article to read about 12 things you can do right now. The undoing takes time, and some people want things they can do right now, and some people want to go in for the long haul, right? So I try to offer them both equally. So you can learn more. Like if you feel like I've participated in this conversation, I still don't quite understand some of the things Randi mentioned, I want to read, right? There are some people like me who do this work that will say, don't make me responsible for teaching you. I'm a teacher at heart. I love this stuff. So you can always reach out to me and I will have hour-long conversations with you. However, I do always ask my participants, because I can't cover it in 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, I can't even cover it in a semester. Take responsibility for your own learning. There's a plethora of resources out there. You hear something you don't understand, and don't just read the first thing that pops up on Google. Read a diverse set of responses about a particular topic, and then think critically about what you're hearing and come to your own understanding, right? Don't just take something on the surface. Like I'm so fearful of how people are going to see Trump's ad and take that as truth. Because one, it isn't true. That will never happen. So it's not even true, but there are people that will take that as truth, and then they will base their actions or their support on that one singular thing. If you see that, challenge yourself. Let me go see what defunding the police really means. Google that and you will see, right? So learn more, take responsibility for your own learning, but reach out to people who are willing to teach. Don't just stop any random Black person and ask them questions, because not everybody wants to do that. So don't do that. Make sure who you reach out to is somebody that is willing, because we don't want to do that. So do more. I always challenge people to do more, right? And so talk to your friends and people in your community. One of the things I hear with doing this work with a lot of white people is that they only know people who look just like them. Most of us do only know people that just look like us. But what that means is often we're not getting diverse perspectives, right? So once you learn, you can share, right? So Maya Angelou said, once you know better, you do better. So once you participate in this presentation today, and you said, you know what, I was challenged with defund the police, but I know more than when I came on, and you hear it at your dinner parties and things like that. Take responsibility to talk to people in your community and raise their awareness. That's something we all can do, and it doesn't cost us anything, right? Do it with a mask on though. And urge your elected officials to support legislation. I cannot stress this enough, because this is where I live in my daily life. When they introduced the soda tax, when they introduced all these different taxes that are now impacting us in ways that we don't like or do like or whatever, and when they defunded Care for Kids, when I already know parents can't afford childcare, we showed up at the Capitol, and you can send written testimony, you can send a video, you can just keep calling them till they get tired of you. Last year we went to DC for Advocacy Day. We met with all our elected officials. And we have to also talk to people, not just that are already supporting what we're supporting, right? Like, it's no point, and not no point, but don't spend a tremendous amount of energy talking to people who already agree with this. Try to bring other people into conversation who are on the margins, on the fence about these issues, don't know, right? Those are the people who are voting and making, voting for policies that impact us, right? So last year, when they introduced the legislation for students to learn history, right now it's an elective, we're trying to grow that, but the young people that showed up in droves just to say, listen, we want to see ourselves. We want to see ourselves, and we should see ourselves. We should be learning about our history as well. So we urge you to monitor and support legislation that aligns with the demands of the movement. And then find ways to use your platform to amplify those who are leading the movement. And last but not least, if you just want to contribute money, cool. That's your thing. Not gonna never knock a hustle, never gonna turn down a dollar, right? So here's a bunch of organizations that you can support. The links are in here. We have Shown Up for Racial Justice, CT Organized Now, CT Black Women, Black Lives Matter New Haven, the Connecticut Bail Fund. There's all these things you can contribute to that lets those people do what they do. One of the things that I think about a lot in nonprofit work is because often people who are running the programs are not the people impacted. It is their jobs to show up at those meetings. But there's just a way that we don't think we should pay people who are speaking on behalf of themselves to show up too, right? And so some of these organizations allow people not to have to focus on putting food on their table, but can focus on continuing the movement and showing up every day, making sure our voices are heard, making sure we're at the door, making sure we're in the room. So they should be supported in that work. So I urge you, if that's what you want to do to contribute, great, thank you. I would like you though to continue to learn and continue to examine ways that you can align your values within your organization or in your business with these core values if you really do support Black Lives Matter, right? Because it's not just about police and vigilante justice, it's about leadership, it's about economic opportunity, it's about showing up differently for young children, it's making sure that there are critical investments in communities that aren't currently invested in positive things, but are invested in over, proactive policing. I call it proactive policing. But I do want to leave you with this quote from Nepal Kielzy, a 90-year-old activist from Black Lives Matter movement in New York. She says, yes, we want to see companies funding causes against social justice. So we absolutely accept your donations. Thank you. But we also want these businesses to push elected officials to adopt policies that result in real change. Not giving money to those politicians who are not helping us despite being elected to represent the people. When people are elected, they're elected to represent the best interests of a particular community, locale, or wherever they are. Connecticut is inclusive, segregated though it may be, of Black people too. And so when those legislations come up, we should be challenging our legislators to include and say Black Lives Matter here too.
Randy, I have a question.
Yes.
So I think I know what you're going to say, but
Yeah.
what would you say to businesses that are worried about losing customers for political
Absolutely.
reasons?
So that's my next step, right?
Yes.
So here's the thing. That my honest answer to that is the sacrifice. I know that's not the answer people want, but that is where we are in this country. I'm sorry to say it. That's the reality. I said I was a truth teller, and that's the truth. It may mean that some people may not come. That is the reality. If you support this, if you put the Black Lives Matter sticker on your window, someone may be offended by that. That is the truth. That is a fact. As a business owner, you need to make the decision. I can't tell you what to decide, right? Like I can't force my beliefs on you. I'm just going to say that that's a real reality. When I opened my business in Marlin Works, and it says first Black collaborative space by Black owned, And then when I did interviews, I said, yes, we are centering our space on people of color. Some people were challenged by that. Some people don't support us. I had one person say, send me a note who we were trying to partner with, send me a note and say that we were being divisive and that there was one race and the human race, right? And I said to her, that's very unfortunate because part of your statement is true. When you look at, you know, when you look at it from an anthropological or biological perspective, if you open us up in the inside, we all got the same stuff. However, race does play a major role in people's lives and it does have real impact. And so, yes, that means it's going to have impact on your business if you put a Black Lives Matter sticker in the window and one of your customers is not too happy. I can't tell you that there's a one size fits all for that. What I can tell you and ask you is you to challenge yourselves to think about that decision point for yourself and which side of the movement you want to be standing on, which side of the conversation you want to be standing on. It does mean, you know, having that on my door creates offense for someone. I get it. Okay. But that doesn't mean I'm going to change it. I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to compromise personally as a business owner. And I live out my values in my business as my personal values. And I'm not going to compromise my integrity for $1.
I've seen it on the flip side too. So Randy lives not too far away from me. So Randy, as you know, going into Brantford, there's a company that has a huge Trump 2020 sign with the large American flags and all that, and they make it known to everyone what their stance is and where they are. And I when I first saw it, I had the same question. Are they trying to attract a certain type of customer, or are they trying to detract certain customers? Because we're not going to go there, right? They're not going to get my money. It's the same.
I don't think it's either or. I don't think it's either or. And that's the thing. I think what I do believe and what I have noticed, what I have observed is that there's a history in this country where white values can be lived out in every aspect of their lives. However, when we start talking about people of color, those values are not welcomed. So that business owner may very well hold the same values Trump holds. That's the truth, right? And they've chose their business, it's their business and there's a platform. And they don't even care whether it sends you or I away. It's their values. They're going to illuminate their values, right? And so when, I forgot her name just that quick because she says Ives Squared in her box.
Colleen.
Please, when you ask me the question, it's a really good question for a business because at the heart of this conversation is how will you live out your values through your business? If you value Black lives and you want to state that, and that is a core value you hold, do you separate it from your business? And if you do, reflect on why, and then reflect on, is this the person I want to be? There are many things that I don't get, opportunities I don't get when I'm referred because of the way that I do the work. That's fine because it's safe to talk about inclusion. It's safe to talk about diversity. It's less safe to talk about racism and use those words. So I've been doing this for a really long time. And this is the first year people are okay with the title being anti-racist. That people used to have visceral reactions to that a year ago. And so, but those are my core values. And so when I work with an organization, I always say to them up front, don't do one and done. If this is one and done for you, don't do this work. It's not authentic. It's not going to get you anywhere. There are people who don't call me because they don't like that message. That is okay. That is my core value, right? And so as a business owner, we have to question our core values as individuals, how that comes into our business and how will those values be lived out within our business? Because on the flip side of that, to what Sammy highlighted, I may not support you if you put an All Lives Matter sticker in that window. If I walk up to your door, because I know what that means and it's triggering for me, so I'm going to turn around. So that's the flip side, right? And then also, even though I said silence is not an option, if you go into a business and neither nor is up, you don't actually think about it. So it's really the intentionality of putting up Trump that has now brought me in a mind space I wouldn't have been in, as well as an All Lives Matter sticker or Blue Lives Matter, right? Like If you didn't put any sticker up, I wasn't thinking about that when I walked into the door. Now that you put a sticker up, now I'm thinking about it. I'm weighing where I want to spend my money, right? And so I said, silence is not an option as a way to plead to your humanity. But if you don't put anything up, right, no one is going to think you're not supporting it, because no one assumes you're not. It's when you make this blanket statement that we know what side you stand on, and then we're making a decision. And there's some people who says, well, this person hasn't stood up or whatever. Yeah, but when I went to get my kid's sandwich this morning, the market down the street, there's nothing up, and I did not buy the sandwich, right? But if they put an All Lives Matter sticker up, I probably won't go in no more.
So
I'm sure it depends on the business as well. Yeah,
it does depend on the business as well.
Yeah.
But again, the whole point of this presentation and saying, what does it matter to your business, really rethink, what does it matter to your business? Ask yourself that question, reflect on that, and then decide how you want to live out those values.
Because it's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
It's a powerful platform to have a business. Not everyone has a business. So I think that's a fantastic way to show what you care about.
Yep.
So
I realized we're at the end of time and you both are asking questions. So I just want to, no. I want to make sure, because we kind of already concluded on that point, right? Here's the scenario. Here's the brass tacks of it all. Will I lose customers? Because that's what everybody's worried about, because we're at the minute of a pandemic, right? And we've already lost, including myself, have lost a lot of income. But that's not going to change the way I have this conversation. And so, if you're a business and you're on this call and that's the question that you're asking yourself, right? Think about that. That is your takeaway from this conversation, is as a business owner, if you came to this conversation and you were really concerned with how does this moment of protest and this resurgence around this hashtag and this thought about Black Lives Matter, how does that translate down to my customers and people supporting me, right? That is a point of reflection for you. And then we can transition into a different conversation after you critically reflect on that. Because it does come down to your values that you hold as an individual and your values that you hold down as a business. There is so much work I lose because of the way I do my work. And I lay down at night and I'm like, my kids have a meal and I'll go from there. I'm not going to compromise or do my work differently because for the safety of $1. I'm not saying you all need to do that. I'm saying that reflect on the reasons that come up for you, right? That's the first step. And then start to pick apart that and investigate that a little bit more. And so that you can really come to a real thoughtful decision about how will I move forward. Faith Kim had her hand raised and then she put it down. So I just want to give her the opportunity to put her hand back up and turn on her video and ask her question.
Hi. I was actually clapping. I didn't mean to raise my hand. Instead of, there's no snapping, there's no, so I was just clapping.
Right. So I have a question though, Randy, since
Yes.
didn't. So I know a lot of the non-Black people on the call are allies, or they think they're allies, or they want to be allies, or they're open to this conversation. What about the space of white business owners and business owners who don't make a space for this conversation, who aren't receptive to this conversation in the workplace, who are still oppressing their employees? What do you do in your work to try to infiltrate those people and try to get them to change their way of thinking? Because the people are here because they want to hear this message.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the people that aren't here, right? And so there was a do more slide that says talk to your friends. Chances are, when we don't identify as people of color and we're allies, we know people in our personal, professional, and extended networks who don't support that. Take that as an opportunity to host a dinner party and have the conversation. That's the only thing you can do. Everything starts with a conversation, right? And then through that dialectic process, you invite people to critically think about the things that they're saying. There is in my link where it says, resources for white people, there's a link that tells you how to actually have these conversations. I would advise you, before you start talking, is you have to have a core understanding of what you're talking about so that you can really engage in a meaningful dialogue with someone else that challenges their assumptions and gets them to really, really rethink what they're saying. And I can tell you one thing that doesn't work. Screaming at people and yelling at them, they only shut down, and it doesn't let the conversation continue. The goal is for the conversation to continue through their opposition and through your, through you holding a position, right? And trying to raise their awareness. And there is a very methodical way to do that where it doesn't shut a person down. So when I do my trainings, even though someone will say something so blindsiding, and in the moment I have big eyes and I can't help but make them bigger, I don't shut them down, right? I don't shut them down because it's the opportunity for learning goes away when you shut them down, right? So that's the one thing I know that doesn't work. There are some people, just to be clear, that aren't going to change their position. So there's a way that we come into this conversation that I had to get rid of when I first started doing this, is that because I'm saying something, people are going to be like, yep, let's go. There are some people that stand firm in their positions. I will say it's far less than it's the people that don't. Most of the time, if I do a training of 30, maybe one person walks away, blah, blah, blah. Another person says, great, because we always take surveys and we kind of read the room. People say, thank you, I didn't know this, I'm going to learn more, right? Most of the time that does happen, but there are people who you will run into where this is where they live, this is where they're going to stay. They don't want to change their minds.
There's also devil's advocates. I run into a lot of
and the
devil's
devil
advocates.
doesn't need any more advocates. He's got a lot of them. He don't need more of
just
them.
Arguing for argument's sake. Exactly.
Yeah. And so there are some people who will do that. And you, at that moment, especially if you're a person of color, it can be totally traumatizing to keep doing that, right? Don't be afraid to exit stage left. Right?
I like that.
We're not doing this.
No.
And people who don't identify as a person of color, where it may not be traumatizing, it's just completely stressful to you, or it may be traumatizing, we don't know, right? You have to decide how much energy you want to expel in this moment into continuing this conversation. You know that person better than I do, and so you have to really say, do I want to keep doing this? But to go broader and to go bigger, because I like to level up, right? So to Sammy's question about the people that aren't here, that are doing this, that are perpetuators of this, I urge you, and this is a call to action for all of you, is to reach out to them personally and let's convene a space to have that conversation. Ask them to just show up for a conversation, right? They don't have to put stickers up or anything after. Just come to a conversation. Start there and then see, right? Like, so if there are businesses that you know who should have been here, that you know are complicit in this, then we need to be reaching out to them with personal invitations, with a meeting date to say, we want to have a talk. This is a business chat, right? Like, and we're going to have a conversation about this. And Faith just put up something which is so critical, as I was going to mention this, is that we are in a society of cancel culture, right? And so there's a way that when someone makes an error, we cancel them. They're X'd out, right? Like, with the exception of R. Kelly, he should have been canceled, right? Like, he's supposed to be canceled. Let's be real. Weinstein's supposed to be canceled. The other dude that hung himself, cancel, right? But if someone has a slip of the tongue, rooted in ignorance or misunderstanding, are we canceling? Are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? As a facilitator, I say no. And the reason that I say no is because one of the things we have to understand, this is what I talk about in my 2-day training, is we all have been socialized. We all came out as blank states, right? And we were socialized in our communities, in our homes, by people. So we were all taught the things we know. That means even though when I was 16 and my brother was teaching me about Minister Louis Farrakhan and Malcolm X, somebody wasn't learning about those people, right? And so my origin of knowledge is very different than your origin of knowledge. So as a facilitator, when I say I try to create spaces that are, and I'll be clear, I do this with just people of color, but I also do it with just white people, and I also do it with cross-cultural groups, right? Because to your point, Kim, we need spaces where people can grow and learn, right? And so the businesses that aren't here today, they don't know what they don't know, but we can invite them to a space to know differently. Now, if they reject the invitation or they come and they want to still be whatever they want to be, hey, whatever. We've done our part by inviting them to a space and an opportunity to see what you can't see, learn what you don't know, and grow in different ways. And you can either accept the invitation or not. You all accepted this invitation today, right? And, you know, you accepted it. They either didn't see it or didn't know, whatever, but, you know, we can invite them, like do personal outreach, like, hey, why don't you come talk to us for a little bit, you know? And
they say funny things like, oh, it said Black Lives Matter, so I didn't know I was invited. I didn't know I could come.
Oh, okay, I get it. So maybe we should put Black Lives Matter for white folks. I don't know, right? Like, but you know, you know, but sometimes I go to things because my friends ask me, because I'm an introvert. So sometimes I don't really want to go, but my friends ask me and I go. So think about that in your network. Like if there's a business or person that should have been in here today that could have benefited from this conversation, they may come because you invite them. So as a follow-up for all of us that are on this call, we can think about who those businesses are and then figure out how we can construct a 1-hour lunch talk about, hey, you know, where do you stand on these issues? What are the questions you have? What are you confused about? And it can be less teaching, right? It can just really be a chat about, hey, I don't know this, I'm confused about this, blah, 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 blah. And then we can have a sharing, right? Like I can hold the space, but we can have other people sharing, other business owners sharing. Like, here's where I stand on the matter, and this is why, right?
Absolutely, and learning people's experiences.
Absolutely.
And having a discussion instead of this,
Yeah.
which has been fantastic. And we're going to post this on social and try and get people that weren't able to come or didn't feel comfortable coming to be able to watch it. So hopefully we'll get out to some people that do need to hear this message.
And we do have one question from another Samantha. Samantha's in the house.
Hey,
so
Samantha
has she's a perinatal therapist. And she wants to know, she says, I'd love to know more about how as a professional business I can do more to provide my services to Black people, knowing that it is a huge lacking area and I want to help make it more accessible.
So here's the thing about areas like that in fields, and this happens in a lot of fields, is that often those spaces are not constructed in our culture. So we can go in immediately and assess whether this place is going to be comfortable for us. Sometimes we can choose to go somewhere else, sometimes we cannot, and sometimes we'll just not go at all. So if you are a person who works in a particular field and you're like, I don't know if my services are really aligned or responsive to these other groups of people, you have to build what we call your cultural competency. Like none of us can change our skin color. We can't be different people, but we could become culturally competent and aware of how we're holding spaces and delivering our services that does acknowledge the presence and the values that other people come into the space, right? Like, I don't know if you've ever, like there's a lot of co-working spaces in New Haven, right? And we're not a co-working space, but when we open, people wanted to label us that, we're not that. But I went to a lot of co-working spaces. And if you think about the look, the feel, and what happens when you go there, right? As a person of color who is all Malcolm X and Baldwin all day, those spaces aren't reflective of me. So that's not how my workspace works for me, right? Like I want to hear some Jill Scott in the background. I want to see images of people that look like me on the wall, right? That's my workspace, right? That's for me. So that means that place isn't really welcoming for me. So am I gonna go? Am I gonna create a membership? Not necessarily, right? So, you know, if you're in a particular field, you have a particular business, ask someone to help you about cultural competency in the construction of spaces so that they're more inclusive. So that people would want to come. They have to feel comfortable for you, because if I have a choice, I may not go. So for people of color, a lot of spaces are not culturally responsive to us. Some of them we can choose to go to, some we can't go, right? And so we can choose, right? So the emergency room, I gotta go. I don't want to, but they think I have a high threshold for pain. So now I just have to go through this process that's going to be painful and traumatizing. I have to go to the doctor. I'm sick. I can't choose, right? And we often don't go until we have to because of that, right? So, but if I could choose to not go to Starbucks, I'm choosing. I'll just make some Nescafe at home and keep it stepping, right? Like, so.
I know someone that did that. They just stopped going to Starbucks. They were addicted, and they said, I don't like how they handled the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm not going to support them anymore. Yep.
Never
And
again.
Which someone who's addicted to coffee, that's a big thing.
Yeah, I used to go, and trust me, a tear drops when I pass. A tear drops. Okay. But I don't think you should have my money if you're gonna make it like I wasn't thinking of it until they made the statement. I wasn't thinking of it. Black lives have always mattered to me, but I wasn't thinking of it until you made a statement. So that's a perfect example of something I wasn't even thinking. I was going to Starbucks every day, per usual. Didn't think of it, and then you make that statement. I'm like, really? Because
that's something powerful and personal you can do for yourself rather than just reading or doing this. Like, only support businesses that either are neutral or have come out and said something that aligns with Black Lives Matter. I think that's great.
Yeah, and that's the choice people are making. So for us as business owners, we're all negotiating those choices. So nothing on my door doesn't say people can't come. Right. And I've had white people use my space who appreciate the sign on the door. Right. And the person that didn't do it was actually a person of color that just felt like continuing to talk about race is divisive. I don't subscribe to that value, but that's her value. Right. And so I had to let her have that value. That's her value. Impact on me, it may have, but that's her value, that if we continue to talk about race, it's more divisive than not, because that's her lived experience. Right. And I have to let her hold those values. I just wasn't going to change mine because she didn't agree with them. So, but so no white person's walked through the door and said that says something and I'm not coming in. They're like, oh, you have a great space. Can I use it? And that's what's happened. So
we have another question from Rosa. She says she's a POC, person of color. I was recently called a racist on social media by a friend for supporting and being outspoken about the Black Lives Matter movement. I have since elected to not be active on social media until my spirit is cooled off, for lack of better words. How can one continue to speak on the issues at hand without being shut down? You can always tag me on social media. I would love to help you.
I will speak for you.
I'll do time again. But Randy, professionally, what is your advice?
This is usually when Sammy tags me. She'd be like, you say it differently. So here it is. I do say it differently. Some people consider this sarcasm. My approach, because they consider it sarcasm. I don't consider it sarcasm. So when someone calls me a racist, I'll do like a one-liner that says, I don't have the power to be racist. A group of Black people can't get up and oppress other people. And then I'll just leave and not engage anymore. Like, I'll do something like that you can't argue with and just walk away.
I'm a fan of closing the computer, very, very slamming the computer down.
As a person of color, it can be very tiring and exhaustive to constantly be bombarded with those types of messages. I read those messages as a way to integrate them in my work. Right. And so there are a lot of things that I just keep scrolling by. So I think for our own self-preservation, our own self-care, don't be afraid to disengage. Don't feel like because you're a person of color, if you don't say something, you're not a person of color anymore. Like you will always be, as far as society can see us, right? Like, because when I step out the door, I'm dark skinned. I'm going to be dark skinned, right? Like I can't change that. But, some days I'd like to move through the world without people responding to me in that way so that I could read. And so I'm very intentional about disengaging when I need to so that I can remain vigilant for the long term, right? And so I think as a person of color, I think it's very important to sometimes not to engage for self-preservation. But I also make sure that if I do choose to engage, that I'm armed with ways to engage that just doesn't mean us arguing back and forth and calling each other names. I don't do that.
I think
literally-
that's self-care.
I really will say something like, a bunch of Black people can't get up and oppress a bunch of other people, so stop calling me racist, because that's what racism is. So I will just walk away, because that's pretty much what racism is.
That's self-care. Yeah, it's self-preservation. I think that's fantastic.
And saying nothing. Sometimes I don't say anything. Sometimes I just completely don't say nothing. I'd be like, you know what, today's not the day. I'd rather go to the spa and crochet something or make a t-shirt. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna let y'all fight this out, and I'm gonna make a t-shirt. Like, that's it. Like, you as a person of color, you have to kind of choose those so that you don't become so enamored from the trauma that it starts to reflect on your physical and mental wellness, right? So my first primary goal is to engage in things that maintain my mental health and wellness, so that I can show up for this conversation. Because if I did all
or
that,
you can't run your business. Exactly.
And if I showed up on social media to every argument, I'd have been like, Sammy, I can't do this presentation. I just can't, right? Like, so the only way I could do this in more productive spaces and be in more productive conversations is not to engage sometimes. So Rosa, feel free to just not engage. Feel free to take the break from social media. I have a colleague who works for a social justice organization. She often takes a break. Because she's training all the time. She often just goes off social media totally, doesn't engage in conversations for her own self-care. So feel free to continue to do that. You're not wrong. And as people of color, don't feel like you have to keep saying something.
Also block people. Blocking people is possible.
And I've also found, I have a lot of, Randy refers to, what do you say, people who don't identify as people of color?
Yes.
So I have a lot of people who don't identify as people of color on my page, and some of them may not be true allies, but the true allies, they step in before I can even, somebody will say something, and before, because Sammy, I will go hard, and before I even have an opportunity to, somebody will sweep in and say, no, Sammy doesn't have to answer these questions for you. No, you go do your own research. And so I think that's another opportunity that our allies can use, so that, because we get, like Randy said, we get tired of it. And no, don't ask your random Black person on the street these questions. We get tired. In the recent weeks, my inbox has been filled with questions from people who don't identify as Black people. So don't just ask random Black people these questions. Do some research and be a true ally and support. You know, let it be known that she's probably tired of having to answer these same questions over and over again. I'm gonna step in.
Sammy, that is great. I want to give Randy a last chance, because we're losing some people, to make a statement. And I want to thank her for coming, and this has been enlightening and such a good program.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, even though we spent a very purposeful hour and a half on this conversation, we consider anti-racism as a daily practice, right? Like, it's not a being, it's not an end state, it's a becoming and evolving. So I am putting a challenge out to all of you to think about how you will use the information from today to do something, whether it be with your business or whether it be with the individuals you operate with in your circle, your sphere of influence is something I talk about in my trainings a lot. Challenge yourselves to understand what you don't understand, anything you heard today, and then figure out how you would use this information and bring this awareness to others. Because at the very least, that's something all of us can do. You know, even if we're not the decision makers, we could raise people levels of awareness so that when it's time to vote, we vote for people who align with our core principles and our core values. So thank you for giving me the creative space to do this. I was so happy Sammy invited me, and you all agreed to give me the creative space to do the work the way that I do it, because it's very differently than the way other people do it. So I do appreciate the opportunity to convene this space and have this conversation, and feel free to reach out to me.
What is your email or contact information? I'll put it in the chat.
It's randyrenee@outlook.com.
One N in Renee?
No, two. One N in Renee.
Two.
Yep.
2 E's, that's right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Randy, thank you again for coming in. I put in the chat, this video replay will be on the library's Facebook and YouTube pages. Please refer back to it. Please share it with your friends. make sure everyone is aware of this conversation, and you know, we can all stand to learn a couple of things. So thank you, everyone. Also, as the entrepreneur in residence, if you have a topic that you're interested in having us present, please let me know. If you know a business owner or someone who can come in and share their gems of wisdom, please contact me at the library also, and we can have those conversations next time. Everyone, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. We're going to stay on, right? The three of us?
Yeah, we're
I'm
going to stay
gonna
on.
stop the recording, but
Thanks
we'll
so
stay on.
much.
And Gina.
And Gina.